In a way, it seemed sort of like he lived forever, but Cuban leader Fidel Castro has passed away at the age of 90, as announced on state television by his brother Raul Castro, saying, quote, "The commander-in-chief of the Cuban Revolution died at 22:29 hours this evening towards victory always," which is a reference to a revolutionary slogan. Of course, supporters of Castro saw him as a leader for the people who gave Cuba to the people, while his critics said he was a strongman communist dictator. And of course, the truth is often quite a bit more complex than that. Castro was the longest serving non-royal leader of the 20th century. And you might remember that Fidel had temporarily handed over power to his brother Raul in 2006 while he was recovering from an acute intestinal illness. And then Raul Castro officially became president 2 years later. More interesting to me about the death of Fidel Castro. So there's this one angle, which is, was he a force for good or evil? And you see often, sort of predictable reactions on that, in many ways similar to what we saw after the passing of Venezuelan leader Hugo Chavez. And I took a lot of heat there from a lot of progressives, actually, for what was a critique of Chavez as a strongman, pseudo-populist leader. That's always a critique that exists within the left when we see the passing or big news related to a leader like Hugo Chavez or Fidel Castro. But more interesting to me is that we've made so much progress on the Cuban embargo while Fidel Castro was still alive. I mean, much of that was related to his failing health and Raul Castro in power instead. Much of it was related to Venezuela not doing well at all as one of the chief suppliers of Cuba, and as out of necessity, Cuba being more open to increasing business with the United States. And I'll talk about that a bit later. But a lot of it has to do with President Obama. And this isn't about turning the death of Fidel Castro into a pat on the back for Obama. You can disagree with the moves that President Obama has made, but still recognize that President Obama was hugely involved in some of these changes that we've seen. And the identity of Cuba is something that has been inextricably tied up in the identity of Fidel Castro for a very long time. His passing, even though we've seen Cuba start to move on economically in many ways, may allow Cuba to move on ideologically, culturally, in a way that was only allowed legally by the changes to the U.S. relationship with Cuba that we've seen under President Obama, although maybe not ideologically and culturally as much. And there's something sort of, I don't know if the word is bittersweet or ironic or melancholy, about the reality that Fidel Castro will never see the Cuba that I believe will soon exist, which will be so different from the Cuba that existed during his life. What's the future of Cuba? I mean, Raul Castro himself is 85 years old at this time, and it was suggested that the passing of Fidel might totally open the door to real systemic change in Cuba. We saw much of that change before his death, but we may not see more until Raul Castro is no longer in power. More broadly, Castro was one of the last sort of major players of the Cold War. Kissinger is still around and talking to Donald Trump, and we'll deal with that probably in the next week or two. Some of the Khmer Rouge are still around, but largely inconsequential at this point. The death of Fidel Castro is not only a story about Cuba and about Castro and about revolution, but it's also a story about President Obama. And as I mentioned before, and I want to touch on this a little more, it's also a story about Venezuela, which for a long time was supplying so much stuff to Cuba. But Venezuela is in really rough shape right now, lacking toilet paper, lacking salt, all sorts of just basics lacking in Venezuela. And again, in the last 60 years, we see Cuba sort of screwed again by the downfall of another country. Remember, Cuba for a long time had the Soviet Union buying sugar at hugely inflated prices from Cuba, which the Soviet Union stopped doing in about 1988, purchasing $4 to $5 billion of Cuban sugar. But in addition to that, one of the primary suppliers of Cuba, in terms of oil, in terms of food, machinery, spare parts, chemicals, and lots of other materials. So the history repeating itself with regard to Cuba, and in this particular case, really having led to, before the death of Fidel Castro, changes that many imagined we would only see after Fidel Castro's death. So there's a lot of interesting pieces about the death of Fidel. We're linking to some of them in the description to the YouTube video for this segment. And I've already been getting a lot of comments from people about this, and I look forward to receiving more.